Welcome to the final section of the USA Friendship Quilt. I'm going to show you the quilting suggestions for this quilt, how I quilted it. Of course, you should feel free to quilt in any manner you so desire. These are just suggestions. This is the final quilting on my wall hanging. You can see where there's an American flag quilted to the background of the map. It's very subtle, but also easy to make out. One of the things that I did to make it easier to see was I stitched this in a silver gray thread compared to a white. I only used white in the background behind the stars and also in the background behind the flag itself and the borders. I used Superior's Omni thread in the quilting, both the silver gray and the white. And I used an 80-20 blend batting. If you want more definition to your flag, you could use a puffier batting, but remember you also have trapunto in the center. So you have to remember you'd have to go through all those layers when doing the flag, when doing the USA map. So you might be cautious of that. Smaller areas, like shown in the Lake Michigan, are done in a very, very fine scribble stitch to push the batting down away from the states. So with that being said, let's move on to the quilting diagram and my method of quilting. You'll notice on the ends of the American flag where some of the stripes are closed and some of them are open. And there's a reason for that. The stripes that have closed ends are the stripes that you're going to do the feather stitching in, while the ones with the unclosed ends are the ones that do the straight line stitching. And that's just to remind you as you go. Now let's take a look at how the stitching is done. And when I get ready to do my first stripe, I start at the bottom of that feathered stripe row and I stitch down along the line, across, and back up. That encloses my feathered section. Now normally when we do a feather, it looks, and I'll just do this up here so you can see it, it looks something like this. Now if I start out like that along this line, I'm going to have this gap right here. So instead of doing the full feather, I start with a half feather right here. So let me show you what I mean. So here's my half feather. Now I'm going to backtrack just a little bit because I'm doing bump back feathers for this. And then I'll start the next feather. Backtrack. And on to the next feather. Now this is a small section that we're doing, and it's right next to the stars section. But the next thing that we're going to do is just straight line. And we're going to try to make those straight lines go in the direction the flag material would be. So here, since the flag is waving, I'm picturing this to be pretty much like so. So that would be the first section. So let me show you the same thing again in a little bit larger area, so it might make it easier for you to understand what I'm doing. So I'm starting at the bottom of that striped row, and I'm going to stitch along the line with just a straight stitch. Stop at the corner, stitch up, stop at the corner, and stitch over. Always keep your hands close to where you're stitching, and always keep your eyes on where you're going, not on your needle. Okay, now we're ready to start the feathers. So I'm going to clip this out of here so it's not distracting. And we'll start with a half a feather. Now we have part of the United States sticking out here, so that will make it kind of easy. So I can just kind of go around here like that, backtrack a little bit, and start my next feather. That way I have no gaps on the ends. And when you're doing this kind of a feather, when you get back to the line right there, you're just going to take a couple stitches in advance before you start the curve again. And you'll see that this works up very fast. Now you could do the traditional feather like this, but you can see that you have a lot more feather to try to backtrack or to follow along with when you're doing this. When you're doing the backtrack feather, or the bump back feather, all you have to do is come up, meet the feather before it, just stitch along the top edge, and go back down. Come up, get the other feather, backtrack just a little bit till you get down around the curve, and continue on like so. Totally your choice, whichever type of feather you feel comfortable doing. Bump back feathers are a favorite of mine because I can get really grandiose with those, but it's your call. Okay, now we're at the end of the row. So what we're going to do now is we're going to backtrack down this stitching line, and we're going to start down for our next row. Now this row is the series of straight lines. And we've done this before in both Back to the Basics as well as the Free Motion Quilting Sampler. So now I'm going to carefully go around the United States outline to get into the right place. And again, picture which way the flag is going, and I'm picturing the fabric going this way now. So I'm going to stitch in that direction. Get the line above and come down. And these, you don't want to make them too close together. I'm using the foot as my guide, so they're about 1/4 of an inch apart. This is basically just differentiating between the feather border or the feather stripes, which indicate the red ones, and the lines indicate the white stripes. And because we're using straight line versus curved lines like we had in the feathers, it makes a big difference as compared to, well, let's say I filled this in with a meandering stitch or pebbles or something like that. Because those would all be rounded, it wouldn't give as much definition. So it's things like that you need to think of when you're trying to think of what stitch you're going to put in what areas. So we're going to continue on. Now I'm picturing the flag is starting to straighten up a little bit, and you can see by the end cap here. So I need to start adjusting this line a little bit so it ends up in that direction when I get over to the end. But you still want to keep your spacing about the same distance apart, and like I say, I use my foot as a guide. It helps me to stay a little more even. You can see that I'm getting close here, so it gives me room for maybe 2 more lines. So I have to fudge in how I'm going to do these so they're even. There's 1, and there's 2. So the next, I could either break thread here, or I can follow this line around, come back over here, and start with my feathers again. But that's how the stars and stripes, or the stripes, gets stitched on your map. Now let's work with the stars section of the map. What we're doing here is playing a little bit of whack-a-mole with our batting. We'll do that by pushing down firmly in one spot and letting it pop up in another spot. Let me show you what I mean. Now the main purpose of our quilting in this section is to take advantage of what happens to the batting when we work with it. We want the stars to puff up a little bit, which is hard to do when you're doing the same color thread. But nonetheless, I want to really push the padding down, excuse me, around the stars. And I'm going to do that by doing meandering, but very tiny meandering. And when I get to the stars, now I could go ahead now and outline these. And again, I can outline the star. Now when I did mine, I outlined it like I'm doing now when I was using the white thread. And then I went back, actually all the let me start that again. All my stitching for my feathers, stripes, were done with a silver gray thread, and that's so it would stand out from the background. White on white's tough to see, and I did want the flag to be seen. I didn't want it to sink so far in the background nobody could see it. That's a lot of work and not have anybody be able to see it. So I did start out, I'll be honest with you, with white, and when I realized how diminished it made the flag, I ripped it all out and started again. So this part right here, I don't want this stippling to be the star of the show. So this I did do in white thread. And then after I got done with all the stippling, I put the silver gray thread back in, and then I came back and went around just the stars to make them pop up. But that's how you get your stars to pop, just with some tiny meandering. Some people like to do a scribble stitch, and that goes like this. It's just a series of stitches on top of each other. It's even closer generally than a stipple stitch. It really makes your batting flat. There's no quilt police saying you can't go over the lines. That's the nice thing about the scribble stitch. You can go right over top of the lines and nobody yells at you. It looks like a bunch of tangled thread. So you choose which you want to do. There's always options.
Let's give that more definition.
After you have all your stars and stripes stitched, then you want to outline your flag. And again, I'm using my foot as a guide to keep my outlining approximately 1/4 of an inch away. And that further enhances your flag and pulls it out from the background. Of course, the states would have already been stitched down, so I'm just going to follow along that stitching. And then come over here to where my feathers are and keep going. The other stitch that I used was in the background. I didn't want anything real fancy. Again, I switched to my white thread so that the silver gray of the flag would stand out. And all I did here was just the meandering stitch, but I did it in a much larger variety than I did around the stars. And those of you who have been with me for a while know that this is not my favorite stitch in the world. I like a more structured stitch. I like to know where I'm going next. I think maybe that's why meandering and I don't get along so well. But it does have a place in quilts. And I kind of like the effect that this gave. It took away from the straight lines of the flag, and it just sat softly in the background. So that's the only other thing that I did differently was around Hawaii and Alaska. I did a few pebbles around those in order for them to stand out from the background.
Once all the initial quilting is done, you're now ready to prepare your borders for quilting. To do that, stitch in the ditch between the quilt and the border, and then stitch again 1/4 of an inch away from that. Along the edge of your quilt, stitch 1/2 an inch away. This is your marking for how far you can go with your feathers. The last stitching to be done is along the pieced portion of the border, and you want to stitch in the ditch on each side. This will ensure that that border stays true and straight. Once this has been accomplished, you can go ahead and stitch the feathers, the same type used in the flag itself, on both sides of the pieced border. The final part of your quilting is the cornerstones. And what you're going to do here is to stitch all around the pieces like I've shown here in the yellow. The next step is to fill in all the clear areas with pebbling, and that finishes your cornerstone. And that's it. The only thing left to do is to bind your quilt and sit back and enjoy it. I hope you've enjoyed making this friendship quilt as much as it's brought joy to me in making it. Until next time, be good to each other and yourself.